How do you think being from a small town in Oregon affects your views on issues that affect entire nations?
I think a couple of ways. One is that the small town Oregon really seems to me kind of central to what the United States is, and so when I go to other countries, I also do really think that it's important to get out of the capital and go to the equivalent of Yamhill, Oregon, which just means getting out of the capital, talking to people who aren't university educated, who don't speak English. I think that also in covering American politics, that I think that it has helped to come from a area that has quite rural, quite conservative values, that is kind of on the fringe of the Bible Belt, if you will. I think my Sunday column, for example, was about evangelicals in foreign policy, and I think I'm probably more open to, although I disagree with evangelicals theologically and on most political issues, I think I'm more open to their influence because, I grew up in an area that was full of evangelical churches.
You've traveled extensively throughout the world. In what specific ways do you think we all share the same values, and in what way do differences in backgrounds truly divide us?
All of the above. One's always reminded in traveling of our common humanity, parents' fears for their children, I remember at one point one of my first trips to Cambodia, maybe in the mid-90s, and somebody had just told me how Cambodians, because child mortality is so high and parents were losing so many children, that it was just something that people got used to and accepted. And then I happened to be walking through the forest, and I heard these just unearthly screams. And I came across a father who had, just a couple of hours before, lost his son to malaria. And that grief was just as wrenching as it would be for any American to lose their child. Having said that, it's also clear that there are true cultural differences, and in the space that the book covers, the role of women, I think that we sometimes have the misperception that this is really a gender battle between men and women, and it's not. The best predictor of who's in favor of wife beating in a society isn't whether you're male or female. It's your level of education and whether you live in a city or rural area. And women often are just as likely to think that wife beating or girls not getting educated is the right thing as men are likely to think. And there really are different, in that respect, really are different cultural values. I tend to think we psych ourselves out too much about the fact that people have different religious or cultural values. China, after all, had foot binding for hundreds of years. That was a deeply embedded cultural value, and it disappeared very, very quickly. Went from nearly universal or very, very widespread to non-existent over the course of about 20 years. And the same can be done with girls not getting educated, for example.
So, what's the scariest thing that's ever happened to you on your journalistic travels?
My first trip to Congo began with a plane crash, and that was quite scary because we knew we were going to have to crash land, and in fact there was a body dangling from the undercarriage of the plane. and we couldn't dump fuel. We had about a half an hour before we crash landed, so that was quite scary. But then that was followed up by, I decided after that experience to try to drive out of Congo, and then promptly ran into a Tutsi warlord who was busy slaughtering Hutus, and was not happy about my arrival on the scene. So for the next week, he chased me through the jungle until we got to Uganda, and then to top it off, in the course of that, I got the most lethal kind of malaria. So that was a tough trip.
Yeah, sounds like it. Wow.
How would you explain to teenagers the importance of being aware of what's happening in the Congo today?
I mean, the truth is that for an average American, it's probably not going to make, what happens in Congo isn't going to make a huge difference in their lives. But what I would argue is that it's really important, I think, for young people to find some cause that they believe in, some cause larger than themselves to get engaged in. And it could be Congo, or it could be kids dropping out from a nearby school. But I think that it's a good anchor for one's own emotional fulfillment, and a good way of putting one's own difficulties in perspective. That if your parents are being unreasonable, as every teenager's parents in the history of the world have been, then it's useful to remember that there are other kids who are orphaned by AIDS by the million, who have enormous problems of predation by teachers or principals, and maybe that helps put issues in perspective to some degree. And also, just as I think that a connecting to some kind of a larger cause gives one a sense of purpose and fulfillment, that I think is just important to one's emotional stability and satisfaction. I don't think it's so much about writing checks. I think it's more about what one gets out of it oneself.
Okay. With the 21st century's materialism, which is certainly flourishing in the U.S. and growing even in third world countries, how do you think spirituality should fit in with our lives?
I think that just depends on the individual. I think, and there's some evidence that some individual that have a genetic predisposition for spirituality, and find enormous comfort from some kind of a spiritual engagement, and other people don't. So I think I'd probably leave that to between people and their genes and their brains. But I do think that when I talked about the importance of connecting to a cause larger than oneself, traditionally that was what people did with religion. That was that connection. And I do think that some people are now finding that connection through secular causes, such as human trafficking or girls' education, whatever it may be. But in a sense, those can also be spiritual causes.
How do your children cope with your travelings to so many dangerous and remote places?
The boys have been pretty blasé about the trips. My daughter was not happy with my traveling to Iraq and Afghanistan in particular. I've taken them on a bunch of trips, and I think that I think that has helped sort of them understand what I do, and has also given them a sense of the satisfaction that it does make a difference. But it's still hard because there are real trade-offs. That if I'm worrying about Afghan kids 1 week in Kabul, then I'm not around to read to my daughter here, and that trade-off is very real. My daughter was complaining to me recently. I'd just taken her through through Central America, and we were. Our next trip is to Southern Africa as a family at the end of this month, and she was saying, Dad, my friends go to, the Caribbean. Can't we ever just go to a beach? I don't know. That's not on the agenda.
What are some of the ways teens can fight global poverty from within their own environment?
One of the things that I think today's teenagers are really good at is starting specific projects that will make a difference abroad, instead of supporting some kind of symbolic protest that feels good but doesn't make a specific difference in people's lives. Last night, for example, I met a girl who started a group called, called A Spring of Hope. Brittany Young, and in high school she started this group which essentially builds wells for schools in Africa, and this is not going to solve the world's problems of bad water. It's not going to solve education problems in Africa or the world, but for a few specific schools, it's going to mean that they're going to get water when they didn't have it before, and that's a real difference. And I think that there are a lot of young people who are not being put off by the vastness of the challenges, but are making these incremental differences in real places, and I think that's the way to go.
Given all the problems with poverty, education, illness, and women's rights in the U.S., why do you think it's so important to cover these issues in developing nations?
I don't think it should be either or. I think we need to address problems at home, but in the same way that I don't think we should only care about our families and not ignore the neighborhood or the state or other states, I think we also need to address problems internationally. They're also part of our larger family. And often you can get the most bang for the buck and the needs are most acute internationally, when you've got people dying for lack of, girls losing 10 to 15 IQ points because they're not getting iodine in their salt for about 5 cents a year. That's something we can really make a difference on really cheaply. Or when kids have intestinal worms because they're not getting a 50-cent pill, a deworming pill, then that's the attraction of a lot of the international interventions, that they're just so cheap and make such a difference.
Other than Half the Sky, what books do you think every teenager should read before graduating from high school?
I'm not sure there's sort of any, one kind of master list. I do think that in high school it's important to engage different worlds. And so whether that is fiction or nonfiction, I think some kind of effort to learn about and be placed in, it can be it can be a slum in the wrong side of the tracks in your own city, or it can be a book about a place halfway around the world. But I think trying to cross bridges like that, I think, is really important. For example, right now my column for Thursday is going to be about book, which is probably somewhere over there, about a 10-year-old Yemeni girl who was married and then went off to the courthouse and got a divorce by herself. She became one of the world's youngest divorcees at age 10. And, that's an example of, I think, opening our eyes to a different world and understanding that while cultures are different, there is that common thread of humanity. But I think it's also important that that the book be interesting to somebody and engaging. And I think different people will find different topics engaging. So I'd hesitate to say you got to read this and more. Just encourage people to go browse and read and find things that really speak to them.
One of the ideas you champion most is economically empowering poor women. Can you explain exactly how focusing on women would help alleviate poverty?
Yeah, there are a couple of ways. One is that that tends to bring down birth rates, and overpopulation tends to be a huge problem in many of these countries. When you educate women, bring them into the labor force, they'll have dramatically fewer children, so that addresses it. Another factor is that the truth is that one of the reasons for a lot of suffering in poor countries isn't just low incomes, but is some really bad spending decisions, and those are disproportionately by men. The amount of money that very poor families spend on alcohol, tobacco, prostitution, and Coca-Cola instead of educating their kids is pretty dramatic, and essentially that is a function of men controlling those purse strings. And so when you educate a girl, for example, and give her the extra earning power that comes from having a better career, she'll earn more, and she's going to invest that money in her kids, while a man might be more inclined to invest in beer.
I really want to thank you, Mr. Kristof, for taking the time to meet with us. We really appreciate it. Finally, is there any question you think we should have asked that we didn't?
That's one of my standard questions. I think that there is often frustration on the part of young people because they want to be treated like grown-ups. They want to make a difference, and instead they're sitting in classrooms being fed information, being tested, that they're not treated with the kind of respect that they would like to have. And I think one of the antidotes to that, there's always going to be some tension between teenagers and the parents and teachers over that kids will want more autonomy, more respect, more ability to go and do things, and parents, teachers will always want to try to protect them, and that tension is always going to exist. But I think one way to address this desire on the part of teenagers to do more is these kinds of activities where one learns by supporting a school somewhere, building wells, whatever it may be. And I think that that is something that we have to become much better at encouraging among teenagers, and it would be good for education. And I think it would also be something that a lot of teens would just derive a great deal of dignity and self-respect from. Thank you. More power to you.
I recently spent a month in South Africa at an AIDS orphanage, which was an unbelievable experience. But most of my friends feel that one short trip can't really make a difference, and a lot of their parents won't let them visit third world countries due to the crime, disease, etc. How do you think these attitudes can be changed?
One of the things that I think we've learned is that Americans typically go off to an orphanage in South Africa, or build homes in Ecuador, or whatever it may be, thinking, wanting to help other people. And in truth, helping other people is always harder than it looks, and those efforts have a somewhat mixed record. But I think they have an almost perfect record in helping ourselves. And so, without knowing anything more about your experience, my hunch is that you managed to help some AIDS orphans in South Africa, but probably pretty marginally for one summer. But I bet it had an absolutely transformative effect upon you, and that those AIDS orphans ended up helping you probably a lot more than you ended up helping them.
Well, that was definitely true for me, and that's what I found. I found that I had not had as much of an effect on them as they had on me, and so when I got back, I decided to create a calendar using the photos of the children that I took, which I sold for $25 each and managed to raise $15,000, which I then sent back to the orphanage, and they used it to build a garage there.
Educated by AIDS orphans in South Africa. And I think that a summer is, if the question is a summer too short a time to really have a transformative effect on AIDS orphans or whomever? Yeah, maybe. Is it too short a time to have a transformative effect on some American kid going over there? Not at all. And how one deals with parents who are understandably concerned about their kids, that's a real problem. One thing I would say is that I think that American girls tend to often think, well, travel in Latin America or Asia or Africa, that's something guys can do, but it's too scary for girls. And I think that's just a misperception. It's not clear to me that it's any more dangerous for girls in practice to travel than for guys. And it's not, Australians and New Zealanders, young people, travel in the developing world all the time, and there isn't that perception among them that it's more dangerous for young women. This is really kind of an American perception, and I fear that kind of self-imposed restriction ends up keeping young women away from experiences that would be completely transformative. And there are enough constraints we have in our lives that we don't need to impose our own upon ourselves.
Mr. Kristof, thank you again for letting Teen Ink do this interview. We really appreciate it, and we're really honored to be here. What impact has your book, Half the Sky, made already as a result of its great success?
I think that it's helped build a broader conversation about the role of women in development. I think that the impact has less been in terms of surprising people about bad things that happen, and more making people think that if you want to address problems with global poverty, that the most cost-effective way of doing that is precisely to invest in educating girls and bringing women into the labor force. And frankly, we were pushing on an open door. This was an issue whose time had come, and I think that we were really lucky in the timing of it.
Journalists often speak of being torn between writing about terrible situations they witness and trying to fix them. How do you personally strike that balance?
By and large, I'd say I'm not torn in that way. I mean, there are moments, but in general, I think that the greatest impediment to change tends to be public awareness, and that's what I'm pretty good at. I mean, I have this great spotlight, and I can shine it on an issue and help project it on the agenda, and that tends to be a pretty effective way to start building the political will to generate change. And in general, I'm not torn by that crisis of confidence.
You and your wife, Cheryl Wu Dunn, often work together. Which came first, your romantic relationship or your work relationship?
The romantic relationship, and in fact, that was a little bit awkward at first because I was working for the New York Times in Los Angeles covering business, and Cheryl was in Los Angeles for the Wall Street Journal covering business. So we were competitors. And so we couldn't really talk about anything that either of us was doing. And my calls to her at the office were always, I was afraid I was going to get her fired. But it's been terrific to, not only share a marriage, but also share these professional projects.
Can you also describe the process of writing together?
We tend to talk through a project, how we want to approach it. One or the other of us will do the reporting. We almost never go out jointly and do reporting. And then typically that person will then do the writing. And then the other person will then go over it and edit it, typically quite heavily, and do a lot of changing. And then the first person will go back and look indignant and tinker some more with it. And the upshot is that I think by and large it's pretty hard to go through Half the Sky, for example, and figure out what parts started out written by Cheryl and which parts started out written by me. And part of that is that we tend to think a lot alike, but it really was very much a combined work product.
Did your perspective on any of the women's issues differ from the perspective of your wife?
Yeah, I think Cheryl had a more kind of just intuitive awareness of a lot of the issues, while mine was more learned, if you will. The major sort of disagreement, if you will, was in the balance between research and studies and stories. And Cheryl I was always trying to insert studies and Cheryl was always saying that makes it too boring, and so that tended to be part of the balance, but I can't think right now, right offhand, of any issue where we really had a different take on it.
Given the current proliferation of news resources, what can young people do to educate themselves about what media reports are worth listening to?
Well, of course, my answer would be read the New York Times every day. Maybe the biggest thing that I would caution against is something that is very human, and that is to seek out sources that we agree with. There is a deeply ingrained tendency for liberals and conservatives alike to find sources and that just seem incredibly reasonable, which tends to be those sources that will confirm our every prejudice. And so for conservatives, that would be to watch Fox News. For liberals, it would be maybe MSNBC, and websites on blogs on either end. And I think that tends to be bad for democracy and bad for one's own intellectual development. I think it's really important to expose oneself to smart analysis that disagrees with everything we hold dear. So I would really encourage students to bite the bullet and go out and kind of seek out intelligent views that will challenge the things they hold dear.
What would it take to get mainstream media to cover the overwhelming number of girls and women forced into sexual slavery and to get people to take action?
I think what it takes to get people to take action is just getting the issue on the agenda. I think that the only reason it's not acted on is that people really aren't aware of the stories, and it always seems ironic to me that if a white middle class girl goes missing, there's going to be an Amber Alert. CNN is going to put out bulletins about, missing blonde, whatever. And yet, every day, there are so many girls from less advantaged backgrounds, typically of color, who run away from a bad home situation, go to the bus station, and the only person who is looking out for her is a pimp. And, I think that if people were more aware of that and understood the brutality of some of these situations, then they'd be more inclined to act. And, that's where we writers come in. And how we get, in general, one of the shortcomings of the news media is we're very good at covering what happened yesterday. We're not very good at covering what happens every day. And that's one of the problems. One of the reasons we don't tend to cover human trafficking very much is that it's just part of the background noise.
You've written that huge natural disasters, such as the recent earthquakes in Haiti and Chile, garner more attention and aid than ongoing problems like the civil war and rape epidemic in Congo. What could be done to change this?
Well, that's a challenge for journalism. The reality is that there is huge interest in these one-off events, and there isn't huge interest in these ongoing challenges. But if we in journalism claim very special privileges because we think we fulfill an important social role, then I think we also have to push back at that human tendency and really try to give coverage and shine a spotlight on the daily, mundane tragedies that typically don't get attention.
It must be depressing to witness so much human suffering. How do you stay optimistic?
It actually is much less depressing than one might think, and I'm sure you encountered this same thing at the orphanage, that when people get tested, then there are some people who do terrible things, and you see unbelievable brutality. But you also see unbelievable courage and altruism, people rising to the occasion, expressing their humanity by just doing things that are almost unimaginable. And so in places like Congo or brothels in Cambodia or wherever else, I see extraordinary levels of brutality, but I also see extraordinary levels of courage and compassion and activism. And I managed to come back from those places actually kind of reassured about what the wonderful things that human beings are capable of, and often truly inspired.
If you could meet any writer, living or dead, who would it be and why?
Probably William Shakespeare, partly to see if he was indeed the author of the plays. Quiz him about some of his sonnets, maybe. The family lore is that we're related to Shakespeare through his cousin Humphrey Shakespeare, and so I'd want to ask him about that, find out if it's true. So he'd be high on my list. I think that his he had a mastery of writing, of expression, that has seldom been equaled and never surpassed.
Other than your own writing, of course, are there any sources you would recommend for teenagers interested in learning more about the issues of women in developing nations?
Oh, absolutely. There are a bunch of really accessible books on it. This book I'm just writing about is called I Am Nujud, age 10 and divorced. There's a book about sex trafficking by a survivor called Somali Mam, called I forget what. There's a wonderful book by a Darfur survivor called Tears of the Desert. Her name is Halima Bashir. I see it up there. And, they all kind of fit this rubric of people who offer us a window into very different societies, but also ultimately, I think, end up really being inspiring.
A lot of teenagers equate success with money. What does success mean to you?
Money would be pretty low on the agenda. I think a sense of personal satisfaction, kind of comfort with oneself and with what one has done would be very high on the list. I think happiness is a pretty useful thing. A sense that I think that tends to come from a sense that one is doing a certain amount of good in the world, that one is looking at not only for oneself but also for one's larger hive.
What's the best way to get apathetic teens involved in global issues? There seem to be a lot who just don't care. What would you suggest they do?
In general, I think it's important to figure out ways of getting teens active in organizations, and not just learning about things in the classroom, but to the extent that schools can encourage students to start their own organizations or join organizations and actually do things. I think that's important. And the other would be doing more to encourage students to travel and get out of their comfort zone, not just go in herds to Paris or Italy, although that's fine, but to travel in the developing world, and to take a gap year more often between high school and college. So few American students take a gap year, and I think it really can be a major part of one's education.
Even though there's not much of a problem with racism, sexism, or religious tolerance in my school, I know it's a problem for many. What can teens do to make a difference?
I think a lot of our lifelong attitudes and approaches tend to be embedded when we are in adolescence, and so it becomes especially important in high school to build a more tolerant approach. And I think that one of the crucial things is simply exposure and building friendships that cut across different barriers. And I think one of the unfortunate trends has been that the U.S. has become, in some ways, more divided, so that any given school is very likely to be overwhelmingly minority, Black or Latino, for example, or overwhelmingly white, and that people often don't have those kinds of just really warm friendships that aren't about race, but are just about a friend, that I think kind of humanize different groups.
How do you feel about the idea that Westerners should stop interfering in African, Asian, and South American problems and let the people in those places work out their culture's problems for themselves?
Well, I'm very skeptical of it in the sense that, in places like Darfur, the way their problems are being worked out is that the guys with the guns are shooting the people without the guns. So in that kind of situation, I don't think we should stand back to let the problems work themselves out. But in another sense, I do think that there is something important there that I think too often Americans march in and say, we're educated, we know about the world, and so sort of pick up the megaphone and tell everybody, okay, here's what we're going to do. And they don't listen enough. And I think that's one reason why some of our development efforts haven't gone as far as they could, that we often don't fully understand the societies that we're trying to tinker with, that we have great intentions, but spend a little too much time organizing people and not enough time empowering local people, and that the result is that we accomplish less than we might.
What are some common myths about developing nations that you would like to dispel?
I think that there tends to be this sense that there may be a couple. I mean, I think there's a fairly common feeling among Americans that Africa is hopeless. Their views about Africa tend to be shaped by the worst performing countries there. People think of Africa, they think of Sudan, Congo, riots, war, religious conflict, and all those things are real, but they're also unusual in a continent that overall is actually enjoying economic growth and more stability and a slow move toward greater democracy. It's one of the things that I worry about as a reporter, that by focusing on the massacres and the mass rape and all the other bad things, that I'm leaving people with a misperception about the continent as a whole that discourages tourism, that discourages studying abroad, that discourages investment. And that's a fine balance for a journalist to maintain. So that would be one misperception, that we don't adequately account for the successes. And the other is maybe the sense that a lot of the problems are due to very different cultures, and that as a result, nothing we can do. If one looks at Afghanistan, for example, where there's certainly an awful lot of Afghans think that girls shouldn't be educated, or there's a real nervousness about girls' education. So you think, well, that's religion, that's culture. You can't do much about that. And in fact, I think that that is indeed an element of Afghan culture, but cultures change. They're not impervious to internal and outside pressure. And maybe one good example of that is that Bangladesh used to be a part of Pakistan until 1971, and then it invested heavily in girls' education. And so today, actually, in Bangladesh, there are more girls in high school than there are boys. While in Pakistan, on the other hand, girls are lag way behind boys, and in the tribal areas of Pakistan, female literacy is only 3%. So, cultural obstacles are real, so are religious ones, but those obstacles can be overcome.
How has the global poverty situation changed in the past 20 years, both positively and negatively?
I think there's an awful lot more hope. One is East Asia's success. East Asia has really shown that that we don't have to just put up with poverty, that we can make incredible progress against it. And now, more recently, India is beginning to show that as well. It's beginning to sort of come out. And some countries in Africa as well have been growing incredibly quickly. I think we're also getting a better sense of what works, and partly that's because there are more Americans who have been going out and living embedded in rural areas in the middle of nowhere. For example, in the world of education, we always think about getting more girls in school just by building schools, but we're also learning that if you deworm kids, then that will get them in school. There was just a study from Ghana that showed that if you help high school girls manage menstruation, then that reduces absenteeism by half, because one of the reasons girls in poor countries stay out of school is when they have their periods, they don't have any kind of hygiene products and they just stay home and then eventually drop out. And it's a really cheap intervention, but because it's something that tends to be hard to talk about, and that as a result nobody studies, it was sort of neglected. But we're getting a much better sense of these kinds of interventions that really do lead to better outcomes.
Kids in school often hear that you should stick to writing about things that you know about, and I've certainly heard that myself, but your whole career has been about going into places that were completely foreign to you and writing about them. What advice would you give to aspiring teenage journalists?
If I limited myself to writing about things that I knew about, I'd write about nothing. I mean, one of the great pleasures of journalism is that it gives you an excuse to approach an issue that you're interested in, but don't know anything about, and to educate yourself. I mean, there are obviously risks of malpractice when you go in and write about things that you're not familiar with, and pontificate about them. And I've engaged in that malpractice periodically, but I think it's really important for young writers to be enthusiastic about and care deeply and have a lot of interest in the subject they're writing about, and then if they approach that issue, they can learn about it. And will they make mistakes? Sure, but they'll also learn in the process.
Is there anything you wish you had studied or paid more attention to when you were a teenager?
There are two subjects that they're not. Well, maybe three. I mean, one is that I did a lot of reading, but I wish that maybe I'd done more fiction, and really with an eye to, okay, how is that author writing? How are they connecting to the reader, and read, in a sense, more critically, trying to understand that author's art. And then the other two topics that maybe are a little more college topics than high school, but they typically, often are offered in high school as well, are psychology and economics. And I think that we can learn a lot from research in psychology about ourselves, about how to connect with other people. And likewise, I think that economics is increasingly moving into other fields and offering really interesting explanations of things, because economists tend to approach subjects with real rigor, and so they've been invading other people's turf, and I think it's a useful skill set to have.